She was 26 years old, and she had nothing left. What she carried into the mountains that autumn could be counted on the fingers of two hands. One change of clothes, a tin cup gone soft at the rim, a Bible she read slowly and with difficulty, and a crosspeen hammer whose hickory handle had been worn smooth and dark by the grip of a dead man who had loved her. In a tobacco tin held against her ribs by a length of twine, she kept $52, the whole sum of a lifetime of small savings. With 9 of those dollars, only 9, she bought a thing that every sensible soul in 3 counties had long since written off as worthless. The deed to a flooded mine, drowned and sealed and forgotten, that no living person had set foot inside in 70 years. They laughed at her when she signed her name to it. But what nobody knew, what she herself could not yet have imagined, was that beneath that still black water lay a 7-year-old secret that would unmake the man who had cast her out and build her a new life from the wreckage of an old and buried crime. Settle in for a while. Bank your fire. Pour yourself something warm, and let the night draw close around you, because this is a long road, and we mean to walk the whole of it with you. Before we begin in earnest, tell us where you are watching from tonight. What town, what country, what hour it is where you sit reading these words, for we like to know the shape of the company we keep in the dark. And if the quiet kind of courage is the kind you have always admired, the kind that never raises its voice, then follow along, so that this story and the ones that come after it can always find their way back to you. Let us tell you the story of Della Marsh. She was not born to hardship, though hardship found her early and stayed. Her mother died of a fever when Della was 4, in a mill town on the Susquehanna where the water was always turning something, and her father followed within the year, less from any single illness than from the slow subtraction of a man who has lost the one thing that held him together. So she came, at 5 years old, to the shop of Emmett Coyle, a millwright and blacksmith and fitter of pumps who had known her father and owed him nothing and took her in anyway. Emmett was a widower with hands like carved oak and a voice that never rose above the sound of his own bellows, and he raised her not as a daughter exactly, nor as an apprentice exactly, but as some third and rarer thing, a person he intended to leave the world better equipped than he had found her. He taught her the forge first, because the forge teaches patience or it teaches nothing. She learned the colors of heating iron the way other children learn their letters, straw and brown and cherry and orange, and the pale, singing yellow just short of ruin. She learned to swing the hammer from the shoulder and not the wrist, to listen for the ring that meant the metal was still willing and the dull thud that meant it had cooled past working and must go back into the fire. And on the long winter evenings, when the shop was banked and warm and smelled of coal and scorched hoof and machine oil, Emmett Coyle told her the one thing he believed above all others, the thing he said was the whole of his religion. Everything that is made of anything, he told her, has a grain. Iron has it, and oak has it, and stone has it, and so does water, and so, above all, do people. The fool fights the grain and breaks his tools and his back and his heart against it. The craftsman finds the grain first, and then he works with it, and never against it, and the thing gives itself up to him gladly. Find the grain, Della, he would say, and half your labor is already done. He was a millwright as much as a smith, and so she learned water too, which is a kind of grain that moves. She learned the geometry of the overshot wheel and the undershot wheel, the tempers of a mill race, the way a chain pump lifts water not by fighting its weight, but by borrowing it, bucket after patient bucket, the way a Cornish lift breaks a great impossible column of water into a stack of small possible ones. Water always wins if you argue with it, Emmett said, so do not argue. Ask it politely to go where it was already half inclined to go. She did not know then how much her whole life would one day turn on that single sentence. When she was 19, Emmett gave her the hammer. It had been his own master's hammer, and his before that, a crosspeen of good English steel on a hickory handle that 2 generations of working hands had polished to the color and smoothness of a river stone. He wrapped it in oiled canvas and put it into her hands without ceremony and told her that a tool held long enough by an honest man stops being a tool and becomes a kind of memory you can grip. Then, the winter she turned 25, the cough that had lived in his chest for years finally took the rest of him, quietly, over the course of a single cold week, and she buried him beside his wife under a maple he had planted himself, and she went back to the shop that was now, by every law she understood, entirely hers. It was not hers for long. There is a kind of man the frontier bred in great numbers, a man of paper and ink who never once soiled his hands with the making of anything, and his name in the town of Concordia was Silas Ballard. Ballard owned the mercantile and the trust that called itself a bank, and he owned, through one instrument or another, the mortgages and liens and notes of half the county, and he measured the entire visible world in a single ledger bound in black calf that he kept on the counter like a family Bible. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He simply totaled, and the totals fell on people like weather. When Emmett Coyle died, Silas Ballard produced, with the mildest possible expression, a set of accounts showing that the old smith had owed the trust a sum against tools and coal, and a note signed years before, a sum grown fat, with interest compounded in columns Della could not follow and was not permitted to question. Some of it may even have been true. Most of it, she came to understand later, was the ordinary arithmetic of a man who had learned that a ledger, written in a firm enough hand, is believed longer and more completely than any living witness. The eviction, when it came as a document. That was the whole of its cruelty, and it was cruelty enough. No sheriff shouted at her door. No fist was raised. A clerk she had known since childhood, a boy she had once shot a pony for, walked to the shop in the gray of a February morning and handed her a folded paper and could not meet her eyes, and left. The paper was very polite. It regretted. It cited. It gave her until the end of the month to satisfy the debt or quit the premises, and it was signed with the small, tidy signature of a man who had never in his life had to say a hard thing out loud, because he had discovered that the written word would say it for him and spare him the discomfort of a face. There was no room for argument. She read it twice, standing in the cold doorway of the only home she had ever truly had, and she understood that the machinery that had produced that paper was older and larger than her grief and entirely indifferent to it. She did not plead. She did not weep. Not there, not where anyone could carry the news of it back to the black ledger. She went inside and she packed what was hers and not the trust's, which was very little, and the last thing she wrapped was the hammer, back into its oiled canvas, laid at the bottom of her bundle like the keel of a boat. Then she walked out into the street with everything she owned on her back, and she turned toward the mountains, and she did not look back. Not at the shop, not at the maple, not at the smoke rising tidy and warm from Silas Ballard's chimney across the square. Behind her, Concordia went on being prosperous and pleased with itself in the way of towns that have decided not to look too closely at how their comfort was arranged. She let it keep its opinion. She had a road to walk. The road took her up and out and away, and as she walked it, the country changed around her like a slow tide going out. For the first day, the land was still the managed land of settled men. Fenced fields brown and waiting under frost, orderly orchards pruned to obedient shapes, fat barns, the smoke of many hearths. By the second day, the fences had begun to fail and then to vanish, the fields giving way to rough pasture and the pasture to scrub, and the farmhouses grew farther apart and poorer and then stopped altogether. By the third day, there was only the country itself, indifferent and enormous. Ridge behind ridge of dark timber, granite showing gray through the trees like bone through torn skin, cold rivers the color of iron running fast over stones that had never asked anyone's permission to be there. She slept in the lee of boulders and ate sparingly from the small store in her pack, and the farther she went from the ledgers and the tidy signatures, the more the tightness in her chest loosened, until she realized, somewhere on the high cold spine of the range, that what she felt was not despair at all. It was the strange bracing lightness of a person who has lost everything she was afraid of losing, and has therefore, without meaning to, become free. The place she was walking toward had a name, though scarcely anyone still living had cause to say it. Sable Gulch, it was called, a mining camp that had briefly boiled and then died in the manner of such places, and at the mouth of it, cut into the flank of the mountain above a green and stagnant pool, was the old working known on the county rolls as the Consolation. She had heard of it the way you hear of a curse, from an old teamster in a wayside store who told her, half laughing, that the county was selling off the drowned claims up in Sable Gulch for the cost of the paper, that a body could buy a whole mine for the price of a good dinner, provided the body was fool enough to want a hole full of water that had killed the men who dug it and had not been entered since before anyone's grandfather was born. 70 years, the teamster said, and spat. 70 years, and the water still black to the collar, and whatever went down never once came back up. She thanked him and paid for her flour, and thought about the grain of water, and how it always wins if you argue with it, and how the men who drowned in the Consolation had perhaps been arguing. The sale, if it could be called that, was held in the ruin of a saloon in the dead camp, presided over by a bored county agent with a strongbox and a stack of deeds, before a small gallery of the sort of men who attend such things to feel superior to whatever is being sold. When the Consolation came up, and a woman stepped forward alone to bid on it, the laughter was not cruel exactly, but it was certain. They mocked her the way people mock anything that reminds them of their own abandoned hopes. A slender girl in a man's coat, buying a drowned grave. Someone asked if she meant to swim for her fortune. Someone else offered, to general amusement, to sell her a bucket. She let them laugh. When the agent asked for a bid, she said $9, in a voice that did not shake, and there being no one on earth willing to bid 10 against her, the county agent shrugged and wrote her name into the book and handed her a deed to a hole full of water, and took her $9, and it was done. It was not much of a purchase. It did not look, that afternoon, like the best money anyone ever spent. But she folded the deed into the tobacco tin against her ribs, beside $43 and a photograph of Emmett Coyle, and she felt the grain of her life turn very slightly under her hands. She made her shelter that first week in the least ruined of the camp's fallen cabins, a low structure of squared logs whose roof she patched with shakes she split herself, using the hammer, working the wood along its grain the way she had been taught. She traced the old flume until she found where a cold, clean spring still ran off the mountain above the poisoned pool, and she dug out the choked channel and set a barrel to catch it. And so she had water, which is the first argument any place makes for whether a person can stay. And on the fourth day, as she was clearing the tumbled timber from the mouth of the adit, she acquired the other thing she needed, which was an ally, though he arrived disguised as a nuisance. His name was Jory Pentreth, and he was a Cornish man, old as the hills he had spent his life inside of, with a back bent into a permanent question mark by 50 years of low stopes, and a face like a walnut, and a way of saying the letter S that turned it soft and buzzing. He had come to America in his prime, chasing the same gold everyone chased, had worked mines from the copper country to the Comstock, and had washed up at last in Sable Gulch because it was cheap and quiet, and because, he told her frankly, a man had to run out of road somewhere. He had watched her by the Consolation from the shadows of the dead saloon, and he had come up the gulch to tell her she was a fool, and he stayed to prove it, and instead he found himself explaining to her, against his own intention, exactly why the mine had drowned and exactly what it would take to unwater it. She listened the way she had learned to listen to Emmett, which is to say completely, and by the end of the afternoon they had struck the kind of bargain that has nothing to do with sentiment and everything to do with survival. He had knowledge and no strength left, and she had strength and a smith's hands and no knowledge of this particular mountain, and between the two of them, perhaps, they had one whole miner. He would show her the grain of the rock and the water. She would swing the hammer. They shook on it, his hand like a bundle of dry sticks in hers, and neither of them smiled, because it was not that kind of agreement. It was better than that. It was a true one. What followed was the hardest labor of her life, and she would remember it afterward not as suffering, but as prayer. The Consolation was drowned because, 70 years before, the men working it had cut into a water course they should have left alone, and the mountain had done what mountains do, and filled the workings from the sump to within a few feet of the collar. To go down, they first had to bring the water up, and Emmett Coyle's whole religion came back to her then. You do not fight water, you ask it to go where it is half inclined to go. Water is always inclined to go down. So the task was to give it a lower place to be. Jory knew of an old drainage adit, a level cut lower on the mountain to carry water off by gravity, long since collapsed and forgotten. If they could reopen it, the mountain itself would do most of the pumping, for free, forever. So they dug. For 3 weeks they dug at the choked mouth of that lower level, timbering as they went. And it was there she learned that mining is only blacksmithing turned sideways and pushed underground, all of it iron and leverage and the patient reading of grain, the grain of the rock now, the way it wanted to split along its bedding, the way a wedge set right would open a seam that a wedge set wrong would only blunt itself against. She built what they needed at a forge she raised from the camp's own scrap, and this was the part that made the old man look at her differently. She could make things. She drew out drill steel and tempered it in the cold spring water, straw for hardness and blue for spring, reading the colors the way she had read them since she was 6. She forged brackets and pump rods and a great iron collar to fit the old timber. She repaired the rusted parts of a chain pump they dragged from another ruined working and hung it over the shaft. And where a link was gone, she made a link, and where a bucket had rotted, she made a bucket, and they worked that pump in shifts by lantern light, hour upon hour, the chain groaning up over its sprocket, the buckets rising heavy and falling light, the black water going down by a finger's width a day, then once they broke through the lower adit, and the mountain took up the work, by a foot a day, by 2 feet. The pool at the collar dropping and dropping until the old timbers stood up, dripping out of the falling water like the ribs of a drowned ship rising on an outgoing tide. At the very bottom of the main shaft, where the last of the water lay black and reluctant in the sump, they found the reason no one had ever gone down. The old miners, before they abandoned the place, had sealed the deepest level behind a barred iron door, a grate of forged bars set into the living rock and locked with a hasp gone entirely to rust, and behind that grate, Jory said, was where the last men had been working when the water came, and no one had ever cared to learn what the water had left of them. Della cleared the sump by hand, bucket after bucket, until she could stand at last on the wet stone floor before that door, 70 years shut, and she set the cold edge of a chisel against the ruined hasp, and she raised Emmett Coyle's hammer, and she swung it from the shoulder, and not the wrist. Clang! A chip of rust flew off into the lantern light like a spark. Clang! The old iron gave its dull dead note. The note of metal past all working, and on the third blow the hasp sheared clean through, and the grate swung inward on shrieking hinges into a darkness that no living eye had seen since before her grandfather was a child, and a breath of air came out of it, impossibly dry, impossibly still, that smelled of stone and old iron in time. She went in with the lantern held high, and Jory behind her, and the light fell first on a workbench of petrified wood, and on tools laid out upon it in perfect order, a mattock and a set of drills and a miner's hammer, all of them seized solid with rust, but each one in its place, put down by hands that plainly expected to pick them up again in the morning. And then the light fell on the man. He sat against the far wall where the level ran dry and rose above the old flood line, sat as if he had chosen the spot, and 70 years of that still dry air had left of him a thing more like carved wood than like a fearful thing, and Della did not scream and did not flinch, because Emmett Coyle had taught her that the dead are only the finished work of the living, and there is nothing in them to fear, only something in them to honor. Beside the man, wrapped in oiled leather gone hard as horn, was a flat tin box, and stacked in the dry corner behind him, in small canvas sacks rotted to lace so that the contents spilled out golden in the lamplight, was a fortune, coined gold, old and foreign, Spanish doubloons, and heavy 8 escudo pieces gone the deep, unmistakable yellow that only gold goes, and among the coins rough cast ingots stamped with a maker's mark, and loose in the seams of the rock, dust and nuggets the water had never reached. It was more money than Della Marsh had ever imagined existing in one place, and she looked at it, and then she looked at the man who had died sitting quietly beside it, and she understood at once and with total certainty that the gold was the smaller half of what she had found. The larger half was in the tin box, and she knew it before she ever opened it. She opened it that night, above ground, by the fire, with Jory sitting silent across from her, and inside was a ledger and a folded letter, both of them dry and whole, the ink brown but legible, written in a strong plain hand by a man who had known he was dying and had wanted, above all things, to be understood. The dead man's name was Amos Verity, and he had been, 70 years before, part owner of the Consolation, and the letter was addressed, in a phrase that made the hair rise on her arms, to whoever finds me, be it in 1 year or 100. And because a man's last words are the truest thing he ever leaves behind, and because he had waited 70 years for someone to read them, we will let him speak here nearly in full, as Della read him aloud into the dark that night, the fire snapping, the old Cornish man with his hat in his hands. To whoever finds me, be it in 1 year or 100. My name is Amos Verity, and I am not dying by the water alone. My partner in this working was a man named Cyrus Ballard, and it was Cyrus who cut into the water course, against my warning, in his haste to reach the vein, and it was Cyrus who, when the mountain flooded and I was trapped below, chose not to raise the alarm nor mount a rescue, but to record me in the camp book as drowned and departed, and to take for himself the surface claim, the deed, and the gold already raised, all of which I have listed in the ledger enclosed, coin by coin, that no man may say I lie. I do not write this in anger, for anger is no use to me now. I write it because Cyrus Ballard has stolen more than gold. He has stolen the labor and the wages and the shares of the honest men who worked this ground beside me, whose names and whose owed portions I have set down in full in the pages that follow, and I cannot bear to go into the dark believing their families will be cheated forever because the only witness sits behind an iron door. So I set down the truth, and I set it beside the gold, and I trust the mountain to keep both honest until an honest hand arrives. If you are that hand, I ask of you one thing only. Do not spend this gold on courts, for courts belong to men like Cyrus. Do not sell my story to the newspapers, for that is only vengeance wearing a fine coat. Take the gold, and find the men I have named, or their children, or their children's children, and pay them what my partner stole, and get their mark upon a receipt, so that a wrong 70 years asleep may finally be laid to rest. Do this, and you may keep whatever remains, and my blessing with it. Work with the grain of the thing, stranger. Set right what was set wrong. I am not afraid. I have only been waiting. For a long time after she finished reading, there was no sound in the camp but the fire and the wind on the ridge. Cyrus Ballard. She had known the name before Jory said a word, had known it in her chest the way you know a change in the weather, because there was only one Ballard fortune within 500 miles, and only one black ledger it had built, and the tidy signature on the paper that had cast her out of her home was the great-grandson's hand tracing the very same letters the great-grandfather had used to write her mentor's death into a column. The whole towering, respectable house of Ballard, the mercantile and the trust and the mortgages that fell on people like weather, all of it had been founded on the gold in that dry stone room and on the man who had died guarding the truth of it. She sat with that knowledge and turned it over and looked, as Emmett had taught her, for its grain. She could have gone down the mountain to Concordia with the ledger in her fist and burned Silas Ballard to the ground. She could have taken the letter to a lawyer, or to the county seat, or to the newspapers, who would have made a carnival of it. She thought about it honestly, sitting there, because she was human and she had been wronged, and the wrong still ached. But she kept coming back to the dead man's request and to her mentor's whole religion, which turned out to be the same thing said twice across 70 years by two men who had never met. Do not fight the grain. Vengeance was fighting the grain. Vengeance would spend the gold on courts and lawyers and the pleasure of watching one proud man fall. And at the end of it, the cheated families would still be cheated, and she would have become, in her own small way, another person who measured the world and what she could take from it. Restoration was the grain. It was quieter and slower, and it would give itself up to her gladly. She folded Amos Verity's letter back into its tin, and she made her decision, and there was no room for argument, least of all from herself. So she did the patient thing. Through that winter and the spring that followed, with Jory Pentreth's memory and the county records and a great deal of hard traveling, she took the names from the ledger, the honest men Cyrus Ballard had cheated 70 years before, and she followed each name forward through time the way you follow a seam through rock, to a grave, and then to a widow long dead, and then to a son grown old, and then to grandchildren scattered across the territory, farming and smithing and clerking and getting by. And she went to each of them in turn, and she did not make a speech, and she did not ask for gratitude. She sat at their tables, and she told them the plain truth, that an ancestor of theirs had been owed a sum by a mine 70 years ago, that the debt had come to her, and that she meant to pay it. Then she counted out the gold, doubloon by heavy doubloon, and she asked them to make their mark on a receipt, so that a wrong 70 years asleep could finally be laid to rest. Some of them wept. Some of them did not believe her until the gold was in their hands. One old woman, the granddaughter of a man named in Verity's ledger, held a single coin to her lips and could not speak at all. Della collected every receipt and kept them together in the tin box beside the letter, and the box grew heavy with signed names, and the sacks of gold grew light. and she counted this the finest arithmetic she had ever done, a ledger that added up, for once, on the side of the living. And the strangest thing began to happen, the thing that the dead man had perhaps foreseen when he trusted the mountain to keep him honest. Sable Gulch, which had been a grave, began very slowly to be a place again. It started with the reopening of the mine, which under Della's hand and Jory's I gave up not only Amos Verity's hoard, but a live vein besides, modest and steady, enough to be worth the working. Word of honest wages travels as fast as word of gold, and men came, and then families came, and Della, who knew forges and pumps and the reading of grain, found herself the unlikely center of a settlement knitting itself back together out of small reciprocal kindnesses. She repaired a plow for a man who dug her a proper well. She shod the horses of a family who taught her to keep bees. She rebuilt the flume so the whole gulch had clean water and asked nothing for it, and the whole camp answered. In kind, a web of favors and repairs and shared bread that thickened week by week into the thing that towns are actually made of, which is not gold at all, but the accumulated weight of people choosing to depend on one another. She kept prices fair and her word exact, and she paid the men who worked the consolation a true share written in a ledger anyone was welcome to read, which was, when you thought about it, the precise and deliberate opposite of a black calf book on a mercantile counter. As for Silas Ballard, he was never defeated because Della never fought him. There was no reckoning, no confrontation, no dramatic afternoon when the truth was flung in his face across a crowded room. She simply took away, quietly, and without his knowledge, the only thing his kind of power ever truly rests upon, which is other people's belief that they have no better choice. As Sable Gulch grew and word of the Fair Mine and the Fair Smith spread through the high country, the families who had ground themselves down for years against the Ballard Trust began, one by one, to have somewhere else to go and someone else to deal with. His notes came due and were paid off with gold whose ultimate source he never suspected. His mortgages were quietly retired. His mercantile, which had thrived on being the only door, found itself one door among several, and then a door few bothered to use. His empire had always been made of paper, and paper is only strong so long as everyone agrees to be afraid of it. When they stopped, it went soft in his hands like a ledger left out in the rain. Within a few years the black book balanced at nothing. Silas Ballard was not ruined so much as rendered irrelevant, which for a man like him was worse, and at some point, without ceremony, he sold what little remained and left Concordia for a city where no one yet knew that his name had stopped meaning anything, and Della Marsh never saw him again, and, which is the truer measure of her peace, very rarely thought of him at all. She was, by the time the story properly ends, no longer a woman with nothing. She had a house she had largely built herself, of squared timber and honest joinery worked along the grain, with a real hearth and glass in the windows, and a shop beside it whose forge was never wholly cold, and a name, Della Marsh, that people in that part of the mountains spoke the way you speak the name of something you can lean your weight against. Jory Pentreth lived out his last good years in a warm room off her kitchen, telling lies about the Comstock to anyone who would listen, and she buried him, when the time came, on the green shoulder above the gulch, and planted a tree. And on the mantel of that house, where another kind of person might have displayed the gold, she set three things side by side, which were the whole of her true inheritance and the only wealth she had ever really wanted. There was the cross-peen hammer, its hickory handle worn smooth and dark by a dead man's honest grip and now, a little, by hers. There was the flat tin box, holding Amos Verity's letter and his ledger and the thick sheaf of signed receipts, a wrong made right and kept in evidence. And there was the small, faded photograph of Emmett Coyle, who had taught her the one thing that had carried her through all of it, that everything made of anything has a grain, and that skilled and patient work, done with that grain and never against it, is only love wearing its working clothes. Knowledge made physical, laid out on a shelf. That was what she had truly been left. The gold had only been the proof. She was 26 years old, and she had been cast out with $52 and a wrapped hammer and no place in all the world to put them down. She spent 9 of those dollars on the deed to a drowned and forgotten mine that every reasonable person alive had already given up as junk, a hole full of black water and old death that no one had entered in 70 years. It was the best $9 she ever spent. It bought her not a fortune, though it held one, but the far greater thing the fortune paid for. The chance to set an ancient wrong to rest, to raise a dead town back into the light, and to build, out of iron and water and patience and one old man's religion, a life that was entirely and unshakably her own. Thank you for walking all of this long road with us tonight. It means more than you know that you stayed to the end. If Della's story warmed something in you, share it with someone who understands that the quietest strength is usually the deepest, someone who has always known that dignity does not need to raise its voice. And follow along so the next story can find you both when the nights grow long again. And before you go, sit with this one question and answer it honestly. What have you found real value in? Some person or place or worn old thing that everyone else around you had already written off and left for junk? Tell us. Let us know in the comments. We read everyone. Until next time, stay close.